listener production.
Hey guys, Katrina Blau is here with you for The Briefing. The European Parliament held its elections over the weekend with provisional results showing significant victory for radical right political parties across the continent. So as those preliminary election results rolled in, French President Emmanuel Macron called a snap parliamentary election in the country later this month, following strong results for his right-wing rival party, Marine Le Pen. In today's episode, Antoinette explores the surge of right-wing parties and policies across Europe.
There is a responsibility in terms of what position these parties take regarding the extreme, particularly the extreme right, and whether they decide to collaborate, to create coalitions, to govern together. And because that's a dangerous and long-lasting decision that will have major effects on the stability of democracy.
What's behind the drift to the right? And what can Australia learn with the federal election looming in the next 18 months? That's coming up in the second half of the episode. But first, Simon Beaton joins me with today's headlines. It is Thursday, the 13th of June.
Hi, Katrina. So consulting giant PwC are under investigation over whether their tax avoidance schemes went beyond just Australia. So this links back to the scandal of over a year ago when it was revealed the firm were using confidential government information to influence business deals with large corporations, including Google and Facebook. That ended up resulting in over 700 staff, including some quite senior people there, leaving PwC. There's currently 10 ongoing investigations, including a federal inquiry, and concerns the scheme also influenced negotiations surrounding international tax reforms with North America.
For 9 months now, 5 faceless global figures have exercised sweeping powers over the Australian firm that we were not even aware of. PwC International is hiding critical information from the Parliament about who did what in the PwC scandal, making a mockery of our Senate committees and escaping real accountability. We must bring these shadowy partnerships to account and hold PwC accountable for its actions.
Senator Barbara Pocock speaking there in Parliament in late March.
Yeah, so this is all kind of coming to the surface again. 9 of the investigations are through the Tax Practitioners Board, who have noted the links to North America. 1 is through the Australian Federal Police, and the ATO is in communication with 7 countries around it. The federal inquiry into the scandal released its final report yesterday, including 12 recommendations, which are broadly designed to give Parliament better oversight of consultants and the contract expenditure, along with, a push for increased transparency. It is worth noting, Simon, that Australia's spending on consultancy services is proportionately greater than anywhere else in the world. To South Australia now, and the Premier, Peter Malinauskas, has proposed to ban all political donations from state elections.
I don't care if you're a cigarette company or a shoe store, whether you burn fossil fuels or you campaign against them, whether you're a business or you're a trade union. Political donations are out under the model I release tonight.
So this is a bold move, and Malinauskas is hoping that it will remove the influence of companies who donate money out of politics. So instead, he'd have the state funding allocated to parties and candidates to promote their campaigns. If the bill goes through, a registered political party would be able to get a $200,000 one-off payment plus $47,000 per party member. It'd be capped at $700,000 for operational funding. It is early days. As I mentioned, it is a pretty bold move. The Premier fully acknowledges that it is going to be a long, long road to get this bill passed, with potential legal challenges, Simon, too.
Yeah, definitely early days. The Albanese government did pledge to introduce spending and donation caps after the 2022 election. So perhaps this could, though, pave the way for federal change. And Malinauskas went one further. He said that South Australia were on the cusp of becoming a world leader in ending the nexus between money and political power. So I feel like he's even seeing this as an international move. The next South Australian election is held on the 21st of March in 2026, so it'll be interesting to see if these laws are in effect by then. And I will note that the briefing have covered a couple of stories on political spending and what politicians have declared as gifts. I'll pop a link in the show notes for that one there.
The 6-year legal saga of former NRL player Jarryd Haynes, who was convicted of rape in April last year, has taken another turn. He's now been released from custody after having his charges quashed. The New South Wales Court of Criminal Appeal overturning the ruling on the grounds the judge should have allowed for further cross-examination of the complainant. Haynes's lawyers allege the complainant had lied about contact between her and Haynes. The former football star, who's always maintained his innocence, had already served some of his 4 years and 9 months in jail before this successful appeal. This overturned conviction is the third trial Haynes has gone through now. The first in 2020 resulted in a hung jury, then a second trial in 2021. He successfully appealed that one and overturned a guilty verdict.
Yeah, I was reading about this morning and found that a fourth trial has been ordered, but it very much remains to be seen if Haynes will face another jury. Whether there is a new trial is a matter for the Director of Public Prosecutions, and the state's top prosecutor will make that call. But one of the judges who decided the appeal did say that it would not be in the interests of justice. So it will be interesting to see what happens there. And we're wrapping up today's headlines with more excitement at the Aussie swimming trials being held in Brisbane, with the current queen of the pool, Ariarne Titmus, smashing another record and looking like she's on absolute fire for the upcoming Paris Games.
One of the greatest races of all time. And Ariarne's got the world record back. Bring on Paris.
Titmus taking more than half a second of former 200-metre freestyle record holder Molly O'Callaghan in front of a crowd that was the biggest of the week so far. And the record our Aussie female swimmers are really looking to set right at the Games is the 200-metre freestyle relay. Swimmers like Lani Pallister say they've thought about getting beaten by China and receiving bronze every day since the 2020 Games. The Paris Olympics kick off in little over a month now.
Yeah, I'm excited. July is normally when it's getting really, really, really cold. And to see the Games, especially seeing them in Paris, it's going to be some welcome TV viewing at that time of year.
Do you think Paris are prepared now? I know that they had the bedbug epidemic a while back.
Do you know what I was reading about with the Athletes Village that kind of blew my mind a little bit? They're trying to be all like, an eco village, but it's going to be so hot. Like there are predictions for heat waves across Europe, and there is no air conditioning in any of the rooms in the Athletes Village. They're going to be using this system of pipes and cold water to try and keep the athletes cool. So no, thank you. I might be jealous of them going to Paris, but not for staying in what sounds like pretty substandard accommodation.
I mean, though, Katrina, is that really outside of the norm? I've often heard that the Olympic town is quite a hot place.
Well, it might mean that some of the athletes might not be getting up to as much room swapping in the night as perhaps they ordinarily might. It's just too damn hot. All right, Simon, thanks for joining us for the headlines. Up next, Antoinette is jumping back in for our briefing on the European elections and what's behind the drift to the right and what Australia can learn from it all.
Hey, it's Antoinette Latouf with you. So parties aligned with far-right political perspectives are on the rise right across Europe. French President Emmanuel Macron is heading to the polls later this month. France will vote in 2 rounds of national elections, and calling the elections was a bit of a snap and unexpected decision. So Macron called the election in response to big wins for his rival Marine Le Pen, who's a conservative politician on the far right, and that's in response to her big wins in the European Parliament vote. Le Pen's victory reflects similar results in other European countries like Portugal, Sweden, Italy, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia and even Finland. So what's behind this surge to the right? And also, what can Australia learn, given that we have a federal election next year? To talk us through the developments, I'm joined by Dr. Costanza Sadwiza Petrarca from the School of Politics and International Relations at ANU. Dr. Costanza, thanks for joining us. What do the European election results tell us about the direction politics in Europe is travelling in?
Oh, thank you for the invitation. So we were expecting for this election to be an important one because, as you know, Europe is suffering several crises at the moment after COVID. There hasn't been a full economic recovery. There is recession in many of the economies. Levels of inflation rate are at levels that, many of these societies are not used to. And at the same time, having the Ukrainian war so close to their borders, basically, that means several concerns for the people. The first one is the immigration influx and the stress of being so close geographically to the war, and also what their national governments are doing in relation to defense and defense spending and the potential risk of having an open war so close to home. So basically, there are a lot of anxieties among the European electorates at the moment. Over 50% of voters participated. And we see that basically people that are more concerned with Europe, either on the far right or, defending the idea of European integration, are the ones showing up to vote. Not those voters do not feel that Europe is so close, or that consider what we consider, we name in, or we conceptualizing in political science as a second-order election, not as important as the national election. And so people won't make the time to go and vote.
And do you mind, for an Australian audience, explaining the difference between these two elections and why that might explain a low uptake in those who are perhaps less likely to vote right?
Right. So there is a major difference when we compare European elections to Australian elections, for example, is that in Australia we have compulsory voting. So that means that the majority of the electorate is going to go and vote. In Europe, most of the countries do not have compulsory voting. Exceptions are Luxembourg or Belgium, for example. But the majority of the countries do not. So they are used to having a percentage of the electorate that is eligible to vote not showing up. So what we see is that people are very concerned with the election, either because they think that there are a lot of things at stake in that particular election that will vote, and so people with more extreme positions. So that's the first differentiation. The second one is that national elections are still the most important elections for most voters. And so the European Parliament election is not as important. It would be like a local election as well, right? It's considered second order. So we see that people are not so concerned with either democracy or the European Union are not showing up. And so we see an overrepresentation of the most extreme views oftentimes.
And so are any of these results then a surprise to you, or is it a bit of a trend at those less important, akin here to local elections, that you historically seen more conservative thinkers or conservative voters come and vote?
Well, there were a couple of surprising facts about this election. So we knew this was coming. The question was whether there would be, a major event just before the election that will shift those opinions or vote intentions. So we were waiting to the last moment to see if the the election forecast will change. It was expected that the right, particularly the far right, will have strong wins. As I mentioned, people are very dissatisfied with the state of the economy, inflation rates being considerable and affecting the purchasing power of most voters. We are talking about countries that have big middle classes, and they're strongly affected by this, and the anxiety of the war, and not knowing what their national governments are able to do in the case that there is an open conflict. I think what is a bit of a surprise is the losses experienced by the Green parties. Basically that shows that, a percentage of young voters that are, the supporters of these parties to a great extent in most countries, particularly Germany and France, did not show up to vote. It's not so much that they are switching to other parties. It's just that they are not concerned enough.
French leader Macron has called a snap election, which indicates to most people that he's a bit worried. What are the polls telling us in France?
It was a total surprise to most French voters. and to many of the candidates that now there is a suspension of parliament and they have to prepare elections in the upcoming 2 weeks. What does it mean? The first, I think, point that is interesting, calling for snap elections is not a normal practice in France. This has only been done in periods of, important crisis. We have Macron that formed a new party and is there in the second government. So it's a relatively rookie to politics in a way. It's not a party that has strong tradition and stance in French politics. So it was expected that the success could be very volatile, and they could lose a lot of supporters if the government was not performing. Now, key indicators of government performance are not the greatest at the moment in France, and that has to do with French politics and the decisions of, led by Macron, but also with this broader crisis that many countries are experiencing, including Australia. And so the country cannot recover as fast, and therefore people want kind of policies that would address those concerns. So it is a surprise to, I think, the French public, the fact that they have now an upcoming election, and many of the leaders, they would take European Parliament elections as a thermometer, right, to measure the popularity. It happens in other elections as well with, for example, midterm elections or subnational elections that, the national government will take the message and make sure, right, to change direction.
Yes, and that message then at the EU elections was Marine Le Pen's success, which would have been a concern.
Right, Marine Le Pen's success and the losses for Macron's party. That was the lowest level of shares of votes so far experienced by the party. But as I said, right, this was a new party, and so their decay was also expected if the government would not perform. Right.
And it's not just France, of course. There's been Portugal, Sweden, Hungary, Slovakia, Croatia, Finland. They've all seen a drift to the right in their political environment. And many listening might see some of these countries, particularly like Finland and Sweden, as historically a bit more progressive. So what's going on here?
Right. So there is, always among the voters latency for appreciation of certain of these rhetorics, authoritarian ideas, emphasis on the national identity. That's always latent in any society. The question is whether there is an actor, a political leader, a political party that is able to mobilize that. And at the same time, something else has to happen is that people should be dissatisfied with existing parties. For a new party to come and, gain all that support and be able to attract all those voters. So if these two things are happening, you're going to have people shifting from traditional parties to those parties and those parties becoming more successful.
To that point, in the UK, they appear to be moving to the left with Labour, but I guess that builds on your current point that it stems from a dissatisfaction with the status quo.
Right. And I think, we saw many voters kind of regret their stance on Brexit, right? And we see now the repercussions for the British economy that this has had.
And so what can Australia learn with a federal election looming in the next 18 months?
Well, I think there is a big lesson for the traditionally governing parties here, is to take responsibility. Take responsibility, I think, in two ways. The first one is to be responsive to voters. And today we see that in Australia as well, like high levels of inflation, how, the economy is affecting citizens that have loans and, parents. And so, we need to act basically and implement policies that are going to help the economy because the incumbent party is going to lose big. This is what's going to happen. This is what happens in most healthy democracies. If we are not satisfied with the policies and we are not improving our living standards, we are going to vote for other options. That's the first one. And the second point is that there is a responsibility in terms of what position these parties take regarding the extreme, particularly the extreme right, and whether they decide to collaborate, to create coalitions, to govern together. And because that's a dangerous and, long-lasting decision that will have major effects on the stability of democracy. If many of these parties start collaborating and creating alliances, we're opening up, the political space for losing the identity, particularly of conservative parties, because they're going to have to collaborate with more extreme parties. And later on, having to implement policies that in a way, will affect minorities, will affect the environment, will affect democracy overall. And so the question is here, how do we keep what is called a cordon sanitaire, like a healthy coexistence with these political parties and forces, but without, giving up too much into the extremes?
Dr. Costanza, thanks so much for your insight and analysis there. I guess an interesting point that separates us from much of Europe is that we do have compulsory voting. And that traditionally means that, unlike what we've seen in Europe, where the most angry or perhaps the most conservative come out to vote for change, that we're more likely to have an even spread in our result because of that mandatory voting. But there are certainly lessons there for Australia, namely that politicians need to be held accountable, the incumbent government needs to get the economy in order as best they can, or else we will see a pushback like we have seen across Europe. Thanks for listening to today's briefing. That's all for this episode. And if you liked this episode, why not share it with someone that you think might enjoy it too? I'm Antoinette Lattouf. Catch you next time.
Listener.